Right, hello everyone. I'm Martin Gardner, and I've been working with Salesforce for about 8 years now. Before that, I worked on Siebel stuff, and I've always been interested in data. So in the last 8 years or so, I've done quite a few data migrations. A lot of the customers I've been working with are SMEs who have been moving to Salesforce because it made sense for them, but they didn't really understand much about the data that they had, and pretty much none of them really understood how complex data migrations can be. So could I just get a quick show of hands? Has anyone tried to move data from one Salesforce org to another, or from one system into another? Cool, quite a few of you. So you won't be too surprised when I say that data migration is difficult. And it's difficult for a number of reasons. I'm going to cover a few aspects, a few kind of features of what I've found can help make data migration successful. So it is far more than just a technical exercise. It's not about moving bits of data from one system to another. There is a lot to consider. And I think it helps if we kind of categorize those things, and I've largely arbitrarily lumped them into 4 areas. The first is data, for obvious reasons. The second is methods, so that's how you get something done. Then we have technology, which is like, well, what are you going to use? What tools are you going to use to do the migration? And finally is people, so that's about who you're going to use. Now, I'm going to focus mostly today on data and methods, because I think that's probably what you're most interested in. I will touch on technology and people, but probably not in quite as much detail. If you want to know a bit more about that, come and speak to me afterwards. I'll be happy to talk to you at length. So let's dive into data. What are the things about data that we need to know, we need to think about when we're doing a migration? First up is quality. Data quality is critical to a migration. There is really no point migrating dirty, poor quality data into a new Salesforce org. It's just going to completely ruin your adoption. Now, if I'm trying to build a data migration process, how am I going to prove to my customer that I've not screwed up their data? They might come back to me afterwards and say, oh yeah, it was great in my source system, but now you've messed it up because you've moved all these fields around and everything. So I've got to build in from the beginning a way of proving that I haven't messed up that data. And to do that, I need to measure the quality of the data. So I've got to look at the source system, measure the quality there, provide a metric of some kind that indicates the quality in the source, and then show that I've not made it any worse in the target when we've finished. So what kind of data quality issues could I have? So as well as measuring what's in the source, I've also got to consider, well, what's going to happen when I put that into Salesforce? Salesforce to Salesforce data migrations are a little bit easier from this point of view, because things like, you can rely on the fact email addresses have to be well formed, because they won't have got into the Salesforce system in the source if they weren't well formed, unless of course you've got a text field migrating to an email field, for example. These are a few things you might come across, so email addresses, field lengths, data types, mandatory fields with null values, validation rules being different between the source and the target system, and broken referential integrity. Don't tend to come across that very much with Salesforce if you're using lookup relationships and master detail relationships properly, but sometimes you get people using text fields to store Salesforce IDs. So your referential integrity is not necessarily going to be maintained for those, so you need to look out for that. Next up for data is location. So where is your data going to be stored in flight? Are you going to just suck it out of Salesforce, keep it in memory, and then shove it straight back in? Or are you going to let it rest in a staging database in the middle? If you're going to do that, and even if you've got different orgs on different pods, is that data moving across international boundaries, international borders? Do you have any problems with GDPR or anything like that? You need to be considering that. Third up, we've got volume. So how much data are you going to move? How quickly do you need to move it? If you're going to be moving 100,000 records, 200,000 records, are your tools appropriate for that? You can't really use Excel for that. you might need to use something else. If you're just migrating tens of records, maybe just get someone cheap to type them in. You don't necessarily need to use software to do this. You still need to follow the other stuff because you need to make sure they've done it right, but you don't necessarily need a tool. And not so much of a problem with Salesforce, but can the system support the data volumes you're migrating? If you're looking at really high volumes, you might want to consider things like big objects or external objects for storing this stuff. You need to really understand the data volumes in order to answer that question for each of the objects you're migrating. Finally, in the data area, we have security. And that's both security of the data in Salesforce, in the source and the target, and while it's being transferred. So if you're using a staging database, where's that database stored? What server is it on? Who's got access? Who in your dev team's got access to that? How does it get disposed of afterwards? And do you have any obligations under GDPR? So if you're taking that data into your own, say you're a consultancy, and the customer gives you that data on a USB stick, and you process it, are you then a data processor under GDPR? I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to tell you what that is, but you need to consider that and perhaps check with a lawyer to find out so that you don't trip over things like that. My recommendation on that is generally leave it to the customer. So leave their data on their servers. If you need a VM, get them to spin it up, log in and access and process on their systems so that you're not transferring data to your organization. So this is a summary for data, looking at the quality, check the quality, define those rules with the client up front. Don't try and cleanse the data as part of your migration. I know that might sound a bit crazy, but it actually makes it really difficult to prove that you've migrated the right number of records. If you're merging contacts or merging accounts as you go, it's also a real faff. So get them to do it in the source system if you can. Or migrate it bad and merge it afterwards in Salesforce. And yeah, estimate your migration execution time. Bear in mind platform limits, which I'll talk about a bit later. Okay, next up is methods. And first thing in methods is the contract. Now this is probably of more interest to those of you who are in a consultancy rather than in-house, but you could probably bear this in mind if you're in-house as well, because really data migrations are quite difficult because you don't know at the beginning how difficult they're going to be. You need to do the discovery first, and once you've done the discovery and a bit of the design, you can then estimate how long it's going to take to build. Because if your client comes to you and says, oh yeah, we're just moving to a new org, we've got a couple of objects, accounts and opportunities. You know, okay, well maybe that'll be X. Then you dig into it and they go, actually we want chatter data, we want attachments. We've got a whole load of custom objects under opportunity that are included as well. Oh, and contracts, we want those as well. You get a whole load of scope creep and you end up in a world of pain, especially if you've contracted fixed price. So separate them out, do the discovery. If the customer insists on fixed price, you can probably manage that on discovery as well. Then re-estimate and recontract for the delivery once you know and you have a good definition of the scope. So what's included then in that discovery and design? Now, you've got, I would say, two main artifacts out of that discovery. You want to be defining your data strategy, which is 5 W's, the who, what, who, how, when, where, what if. Basically, how is this going to happen? Who's going to do it? Where's it going to go? Where's it coming from? What are you going to do if it goes wrong? Have you got a rollback strategy? All that stuff is in your data migration strategy document. Then, once you've got that, you can look at the data mapping document, which covers which objects in Salesforce, which fields, what transformations do you need. And you can go to a different range of detail, but you need to cover that stuff there because the effort that you will spend migrating this data will be proportionate to the number of objects and the number of fields that you're migrating. So I've got a bit of detail here on what I would put in a data strategy document. I'm not going to go through all the points there. And also the mapping document. So you're describing mapping, verifying, and discovering. You can do things like checking that you've not got inconsistencies in your data types between your source and target system before you start building, which is very, very helpful. Okay, then we go on to build. So I would recommend a classic ETL pattern. It's pretty typical for a data migration. You're pulling data out of somewhere, manipulating it, transforming it, and pushing it in somewhere else. And I generally use Talend for this. One very good reason is the open free version is free, so the client doesn't have to pay anything extra. I'm fairly familiar with it, and it does the job quite well. I break down the process into 5 different jobs. So I have a get job, which does the extract, doesn't do any transformations to the data at all, just pulls it out, puts it into a staging database. So I've got a nice local copy, which means I can manipulate it quickly and move on from there. And also I have a line in the sand. I know what I pulled out. If the customer comes back after I've done the migration and says, well, this feels wrong. It's not changed. It's not that in my source system. It says, you know, Bob, but in the migration it says June. Well, you can go back, have a look at your source table in your staging database and say, well, actually, when I took it out, it said June. You've changed it in the source system after I did my cut. So therefore, you know, that's the line in the sand. Then you have a map job, which does the transformations. It does all the complex heavy lifting. It probably won't do the foreign key resolution because you'll need to know what the new Salesforce IDs are to be able to do that. That will be done in the put job, which does the load into the target system. Then there are 2 other jobs you need. One, a delete job, which takes the data out again, which means you can do repeated loads of the migration process, helps you to practice what you're doing. And then a run job, which just pulls all those things together, gives you a get, map, and put in one go, or allows you to, say, do all the gets first, then the maps and the puts. One reason why I do it this way is to break the process down so that each step is repeatable. So I don't have to go back to the beginning and repeat the whole thing every time in order to check it. I can just reload the accounts or just the contacts, or I can do the contacts, the accounts, and the opportunities, but not the activities. It gives me a great separation there. Okay, so I'm going to jump out into Talend and show you what this actually looks like. So here I have a Talend project, and I've set it up with the appropriate jobs. So you can see I've grouped them in folders and stuff like that. I've got context variables that allow me to switch between development, test, and prod. Yeah, let's see. Oh yeah, there we go. That one. So this is the get job. And you can see I've got a Salesforce connector pulling the data out into a MySQL staging table on my machine. Got the map job here, very simple, nice visual mapping. This one's pretty straightforward, but you can see here I've got a field, an extra metadata field in my target database that I'm populating with a context variable to describe the source source system that I'm migrating from. You can do all sorts of cool stuff in Talend, and if you really need to, you can write extra Java modules and plug them in. This is my put job, which is showing a previous load. So this is a bit more complicated. It's pulling out of the target account table, doing the map there, which does a few other bits. You can also fit in the reference lookups there for the foreign keys. Does an upsert, and then it's using the bulk API there and pulling out the success records and the failure records and processing those into separate tables. Yes?
Sorry for my ignorance, but is Talend completely declarative? This part is at least.
Yeah, I haven't really had to dig into very much coding. When you compile these jobs, it generates a Java file, which then executes.
Java as a component.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can do most of it.
Yeah, you can get away.
Like do declaring variables that you use in several places, it might make sense to use Java variables, but otherwise you don't really need to use them.
Yeah, it's really nice. I'm really a visual person, so I like the visual flow designer here. It really helps me understand where the data's going, where it's coming from, what I'm doing to it. And this is the run account job, which does a get, a map, a put, and then it does the hierarchy of setting the parent IDs. So let me show you a live example. I have two Salesforce orgs here. One has a whole load of accounts in it. It's a Trailhead playground org, so it's got some nice account names in there. And this one is a dev org, and it doesn't really have anything in it at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my process. I'm going to run my get to pull the data out into my staging table. Talend's now compiling the job, and then it'll execute it. And what I quite like about Talend is when you're debugging or you're running it, it will show you how many records have moved across each path, which gives you a good bit of visual feedback of whether the job's working correctly. So I've got 22 records that have loaded into my staging table. Now I'm going to run the map job. Is that going to work? Ooh, no. It's because it's got a modal. There we go. So I've mapped 22 records correctly. Now let's see if they load correctly.
So this put job doesn't actually do the parent accounts, does it? Because that would be
No, that's a separate job for doing the parent accounts. Because you've got to, the hierarchy job sets the parent account ID on the inserted records. Here we go. So 22 rows go in. Oh, and they've all failed brilliantly. That's probably because I tested it earlier and they were all in there. However, that does allow me to go into my SQL database and check. I've got a pick list value that's wrong. So, okay, let me fix that. There we are. So I know that that is set in map account. It's this context variable here. So let me go in and modify that. There we go. It says curious horse. So just update that for all of these. Talend very helpfully goes into all the jobs and updates it for me. There we are. Let's find the jobs where that variable is defined. Cool. Excellent. Right. So I'm going to run that again. Actually, I didn't need to run the run job again. I forgot the map. Yeah. So I don't need to load that in. It's only from this job on that I need to continue. I don't have to reload from the source system. Let's try the put again. It has to recompile every time I change the job. There we go, 22 go in, and
While it's running, can you say a little bit about the free version?
Mhm.
So you can, what's the limitation? Is there any volume of data?
Yep.
the
Well, yeah, there's not really.
user licenses.
Yeah. So you can't do shared access. So the paid for version of Open Data Integrator allows you to put it into Git and have multiple people checking in and out the jobs. It also provides an admin console so you can deploy the jobs to a server and have them running centrally, whereas this will only ever run on standalone. You can compile these jobs into jars and then deploy them to be executed in the command line using Windows Scheduler. I've done that quite a lot. So it's a pretty functional tool. There are no components that you really need that aren't provided in Open Data. There are a few that you might want around parallelization in the paid version, but mostly you can do pretty much everything in this. So you can see this has shown 11 going into success and 11 going into the failure. Let's go and have a look and see what's still failing. So those are duplicates, which is cool. I was expecting that. And then I've got another query here for the for the successes. And you can see here we've got the external ID, which is the source system Salesforce ID, and the target system ID has been returned. Okay, that's that bit. That's the demo completed. Oh, no it isn't. I haven't shown you the records in the target system. I could be completely lying about whether it's been successful or not. There we go. 11 records created nicely, and they pretty much match the source there. And you can see I've got my external source field. This is the pick list value that failed, and that's been set. So let's go back to the deck. So the final part about build is just to talk a little bit about the staging database. I just have a few guidelines for that. I separate out all the auditing that I'm doing into a separate schema and call that log, and all of the migration data goes in a schema called MIG. And then I have some naming conventions for the tables. Fairly straightforward ones: source or SRC for the source data, TRG for the transformed target data, out for any data that I've loaded. So you might ask, well, isn't that the same as the target data? It's not, because I might have added foreign keys or changed the ownership perhaps. So if I'm loading from one Salesforce system to another and I don't have a one-to-one or exact match on users, I might assign accounts to an orphan owner, and that would happen in the last step. So those orphan owners will be in the out table. And ref is for any reference data. So it's anything that you might need for that migration. So users, products, anything that's involved in the migration but is not actually being loaded into the target system. And then finally, testing. So if you build all that logging and stuff into the process and you have each step separated, the testing becomes much easier, because you can replay and rerun each step really easily. And one of the key things around testing is to define with the customer what their KPIs are. So if they're interested in money, those might be, well, we've got to make sure that we have $100,000 in the source system and $100,000 in the target. We're not interested in anything else. You define with those with the client. You want to be doing lots of rounds of testing. You're probably very familiar with the typical unit test and end-to-end test, UAT, dry run. I really recommend you do a lot of dry runs. Last project I did, we did 3-4 dry runs, and that included everybody in the team who was involved in the go-live weekend or the migration weekend sitting down, going through exactly what their steps were. We had like a playbook that told us what we were doing when, and we practiced it 3 times. It meant that we found a lot of the hiccups, a lot of the problems early, and when it came to actually running the migration, we finished it about 10-12 hours early. Client could do a whole load more testing than they anticipated, and they were really pleased. And that's all down to practicing. You need to practice it, because something will come up, and if you do it enough times, you will find pretty much most of the things that come up and be able to deal with them. So that's just summarizing the methods. Let's just skip through technology and people quite quickly. So understand your source and target systems, what things you've got to look out for. Triggers and automation are pretty critical in Salesforce. If you can, turn them all off, because it will improve your performance of your load. But you need to bear in mind that any functionality those triggers and workflows do or implement, you might have to include in your migration as well. So if, say, you insert a case and then it creates a child record somewhere, and that's in a trigger, you might have to then incorporate that into your migration process. So it will be a trade-off between the complexity of replicating that functionality in your tool of choice versus having a really slow load. And it could be down to like having to load cases 10 at a time rather than 1,000 at a time. There are a whole load of tools you can use for this. I've shown you Talend. I quite like it. It's been very useful. But you can use Excel if you really must. You can use some plugins. There's the SAPEX plugin's quite good for that stuff. You've got the Salesforce import wizard for really simple stuff. Data loader, Talend, MuleSoft, Pentaho, SQL Server integration services, or MySQL. Next part is limits. So this is probably specific to Salesforce, but probably we would come across some sort of platform limits in any other system. And bear in mind that they're changing all the time, so always check them. Don't just refer to my slides. One of the ones that will catch you out is the content one. because if you've got more than 200,000 records, you're not going to get them in less than 24 hours. You're just not going to publish them. So you need to bear that in mind in your planning. Yeah. So to summarize on technology, find all the source systems. We have a lot of fun on the last one we did where we thought it was just Salesforce to Salesforce, and then the client says, oh, actually, we've got some, I think it was invoice numbers or order data in another system. Can you hook up to SAP as well, please? And in the end, we said, no, can you just load it into Salesforce? And we'll put it out of Salesforce. But that wasn't immediately visible when we started. People. So who do you need on a successful migration? You need a data owner. If you don't have a data owner for any object or any system that you're migrating, don't migrate the data. Because someone will come out of the woodwork as soon as they find out their data is not going across, and they will be the data owner. They must accept the output of UAT and dry run testing before you go live, and they must accept the data when it goes into production. They also identify the data SME. The data SME, or subject matter expert, is the person who really understands the data. So the owner may well be a sales manager or director. The data SME is the Salesforce admin or the system admin or the developer who knows where all the skeletons are in the closet. They really understand the data quality. They know what the fields mean and who's using them and for what, and they will help you with your mapping. Next up is your dev team. So, who do you need? Well, this could be 4 or 5 people, or it could be 3, as long as you've got the skills that they cover. So you need someone who's going to manage the client, someone who's going to design the whole process, an architect, some people to actually do the build in the tool you've chosen, a DBA if you're using a staging database to help you if you don't have those skills in the other people, to create the tables, the views, tune indexes, make sure the thing runs quickly, and then a good tester who's got a good eye for detail and can check that the data is correct and that the process is doing what it's designed to do, so the transformations are correct. Skills-wise, ideally you want people who are used to ETL or data migrations, have done it before, and critically understand the tools that you're using. Please don't try and do a data migration with a team using a completely new tool, because it will take 2x, 3 times as long, because you'll be learning about the tool and the particular gotchas of that tool. And the data owner and the SME, really, they also need to understand a bit about the data migration, because you're going to have to be explaining to them why they can't do it in a certain way or what's happened to the data. So a simple understanding of what a foreign key is would help, and understanding the impact of poor data quality on their migration. The dev team, as I said, they need to be familiar with ETL, and ideally, if you're migrating into Salesforce, aware of some of the gotchas. Things like if you load tasks and events with a created date using the insert audit fields feature, where the date is more than a year old, Salesforce has an archival process which will remove those, so that when you requery for them using the normal SOAP API, they don't appear unless you select query all records. That makes it difficult if you do your migration over several days, because you load a whole load of activities on day 1, day 3 you can't find them because Salesforce doesn't return them in the query. The file content and I'd add the chatter data models are very complex. So you need to understand those. There are restrictions around how you can migrate chatter, which Michelle can tell you all about in her talk. You've got limitations on email messages. You need to understand the difference between SOAP and API as well. SOAP and bulk, SOAP API and the bulk API. So there we go. For people, we need clear ownership of data, access to the SME to make it successful. In summary then, data migration is hard, but if you remember those 4 key areas, you can make it more likely to be successful. And those are data, methods, technology, and people. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes?
one of the issues normally have is pick list, which you said,
Mhm.
which you showed us. Other than metadata, is there any other way better to migrate or have? So one of the things is like, I used to work for a retail shop, retail outlet, where it's limited to some European countries.
Mhm.
There was a market to bring in people from China and other places. Now, just like, just add 200 more countries,
Yep.
something like that. Then we realized like it's a metadata change because it's a big drop-down pick list values.
Mhm.
So is there a better way to deal with that, or?
No. So the question is, I think what the question is is there a better way to incorporate pick list changes or metadata changes into a data migration?
200 list of countries.
Yeah.
In the drop-down list, I just want to add this 200 list along with some European countries.
So you want to add 200
So
values to a pick list in the metadata. I will. You.
Create some master object for
Yeah.
the country and store all country in an object. And
Yeah.
that would be
You could.
magic query.
So you could.
Switch off the pick list restriction while you do data load, switch it back on afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah. You.
Should be, is this part of the data migration process? I think it's a bit dangerous.
it's not actually data actually, but
Yeah, it's-
that's how the client considers, like when you can add in the table, you should be able to add in a
Yeah.
kind of list.
So you need to tell. Yeah. Be clear with them that that's metadata,
That's the,
which isn't accessible in the same through the same API. You could build
I
something against the tooling API to do it.
I did use Excel to get the list and
Mhm.
then get the metadata equivalent of that, and then brought back. First, I brought back from the metadata from using ANT. Then
Yep.
took that and then took an Excel and then modified and pushed it back. And
I probably would have used ANT and the metadata API and then manipulated the XML to put them in, probably, rather than an ETL. Yes?
Do you think you could go back in time and tell me this about 5 years ago? I kind of worked it all out, but it was pretty good.
Didn't contact me, Sean.
So, do you have any tips for like a sort of a high pressure moving target? So let's say it's like an e-commerce site, they want to have a minimum downtime, that kind of situation?
To get it done really quick.
Or just to get it,
What, the entire project or just the go
I don't
live?
know, how you approach that go live,
So, yeah, with the last go live we did, we had quite an aggressive target of getting it done because they were a global company and they sort of like, I think Singapore went. So we started at 10 p.m. on a Friday and we were done by lunchtime on a Saturday.
We had 4-hour shifts throughout the
Yeah, we rotated around and we were running data in constantly using the bulk API where possible because it's the fastest we could do. One of the other things we did was for attachments, we knew that was going to be really slow. So we agreed with them we would drip feed them. So we started it off as soon as we could once we had the relevant parent objects. And then they just trickled in and got linked in over the next couple of days and they were done a few days after. So with appropriate watermarking and logging, you could start loading up. The one way you could do it is say, okay, rather than looking at each object in separation, I'm going to look at an account and I'm going to extract all of the child objects for one account and I'm going to push that across in one go. And then do the next one and then the next one. And that approach would probably be more suited to MuleSoft because that's more about doing a single message.
The other approach you might take is identify a core set of objects. Like you might need sales data and some other custom objects that are not so important. So you might say we go live with the core set of objects first, and then especially the bigger ones like attachments.
Yeah, no, I think
Maybe
that's a really good
emails,
idea
notes
to work out what's super critical,
Yeah.
focus on that, and then stay to rest over an extended period.
But yeah, definitely use the stage approach that Martin talked about by loading it all into the staging database first. Separate.
Thank you. Yes?
Two questions. First one, do you have any experience in migrating knowledge articles?
Not me, no. You guys done it?
I've done it before, but we told the customer that we would restrict it to text only, and that so they agreed with that. So we did text only, and then they did the images, and they did it separately.
Do you have any pain points?
Yes. There's a special help article on all this on the Salesforce help pages, because we talk about the translations as well, images, things like that. And there's a whole section on data loading of articles. It's worth checking that out. That's all I know is it was horrible.
And the second question, are there any recommendations on the timelines for discovery?
Yeah, I would say about at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. It would depend on the number of objects and the complexity of the client, but you need a good few days to have a look at it, speak to them, dig through the data, get access to their system and have a look through. But yeah, that's the sort of time span. I think the last one I did was about 8 days of discovery work, but that was a bit tight. You had one, did you?
Yeah, it's about limits. I know a lot of them are set in stone, but is Salesforce kind of amenable to saying, can we have a temporary raise of the limit for the weekend of the migration or the week?
Yeah, you can do that. You can do things where, for example, I've had some situations where they want to migrate a load of records owned by people who have left, and you can, well, now you've got the setting to link stuff to inactive users, but you used to have them load it up as active and then deactivate it, and you could temporarily have a larger license limit. So yeah, it will depend on how much money your customer's spending with Salesforce as to how amenable they'll be. But there are some hard limits. Yes, thank you.
Not so much a question, more a statement. I did data migration 2 weeks ago for ourselves, and it revealed a massive bug in our system, in that we had a process where closed lost opportunities were making an account inactive, and we only migrated active accounts. But then we looked at transaction data and they're going, why is there all these transactions for these inactive accounts outside their data range? And I thought it was the data migration, but it was actually the system error where users were creating opportunities with the wrong type. And people hadn't thought that was an error condition, where it was then making the accounts close down. So always challenge the data you're seeing with my lesson and do those dry runs and you're turning your hair out thinking what they've done wrong. I've got all these referential integrity problems. But that was my lesson just 2 weeks ago. And I didn't know about the inactive user stuff. I wish I'd known that 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, there's a setting, a setting you can turn on now, as you can load against inactive users, which is very helpful. Sorry? I'd Google it, to be honest, every time. Somewhere, yeah. It was either on the admin profile or in set up against the organisation somewhere. Any other questions?
What's the lowest batch size that you've ever had to load data on?
One case at a time. So attachments had to be one at a time.
One at a time.
Cases, we had to get rid of the bulk API. Actually, we had to use the SOAP API for those because we couldn't turn the triggers off, and there was so much rubbish on them that we basically had so many cases that if we used the bulk API, we'd blow our 10,000 batches in a 24-hour period. So we had to switch to the SOAP API and use that. And I think it was either 1 or 5 to 10 cases. But it really depends on the automation in the target system as to what you can get away with. But attachments, pretty much you have to load one by one. And I had a lot of fun trying to do that and parallelize it to make it running quickly. One thing to be careful there is if you've got to pull the connections, because if you try and do parallel stuff and every parallel thread is logging in, Salesforce will kick you out or freeze your user because of logging in too many times for the same user in parallel. Yes?
Is it the attachment, is it similar to the files migration or is it very different?
Yeah, so with the one we did, we had to take it out of attachments and then into files or content versions. Okay. That is quite tricky because you have to load against content version, but it creates a content document, so you don't get the right key back, and you have to do a bit of reconciliation. Yeah, it is a bit of a pain. Yes.
Do you have any recommendation regarding sharing calculations? Means what do you prefer? Is it like you defer sharing calculations and you do? Because many times we have got many sharing rules and all.
Yeah, if you've got a lot of data, you've got bits and it's hitting that, yeah, you would defer them until after you've finished the migration. But it depends on the data volumes. If they're very high, yeah, hundreds of thousands of records, yeah.
So whatever you have done as of now, so did you ever try
Never bothered, to be honest. It wasn't a problem in the one we did recently. Their sharing rules weren't that complicated. But yeah, if they had been, if we'd been seeing problems because of that, that's where we would have gone.
Because we did, in our case, we were, updating accounts. So we were migrating many of the accounts. So we got stuck in sharing calculations every time. So final decision was to defer it and then do it later on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely the way to go for that. Yeah, I wouldn't do it differently.
Around 16 hours for our
16 hours, oh my goodness.
millions of accounts. That was a thing.
Ouch. Right.
In the interest of time,
Yes, we should probably wrap up there, I'm afraid.
grab you for questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your attention.